They say the cruelest betrayals come from those we love the most. I discovered this truth on a rainy night in Missouri, standing outside my own son's house, my arthritic knuckles raw from knocking on a door that would never open. Through the window, I could see them laughing, my son, his wife, my only grandson, as I stood drenched and shivering, deemed unworthy of shelter in the very home I had helped them buy. What they didn't know was that my late husband James had taught me more than just how to love. He taught me how to protect myself, even from family. 9 keys, he'd said. 9 keys to unlock different parts of our legacy. I had given them 8, but the 9th key, that one was about to change everything. Because sometimes the most powerful word in the English language isn't love or money. It's no. Follow along to witness what happens when decades of patience finally run out, when a mother's kindness is mistaken for weakness, and when those who laughed at an old woman in the rain find themselves desperate at her door the very next day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this story of justice served cold is one you won't want to miss. I was wearing the old coat James gave me on our 30th wedding anniversary, the same one he said made me look like a math teacher, not because of how it looked, but because of my steadfastness. The storm that night seemed to be beating down on me alone. Literally, raindrops streamed down my wrinkled forehead as I knocked on my own son's front door. They were inside, laughing. I saw the silhouettes of all 3 of them reflected in the window, and then I heard it, clear as day. Just leave her out there. She's old but stubborn. Maybe she'll learn. I stood there frozen, trying to understand at what point I had stopped being a mother and became a burden instead. The rain was soaking me from the outside, but what truly hurt was inside. The wet cement ground beneath my worn-out shoes, the scent of the garden I had planted myself when I moved into the annex. Everything now seemed foreign to me. Right then, with thunder tearing through the sky, I closed my eyes and remembered the safe and the keys. There were 9 of them, 1 for each broken promise, 1 for each time someone in my family looked at me like I was an obstacle. I had given away 8, but the 9th one, that one I had hidden even from myself. You know, I never thought it would come to this. At 73, you expect certain dignities, respect, at the very least, shelter from a storm. But there I was, my arthritic knuckles turning white as I knocked again, watching through the curtain gap as my son Matthew shook his head, and my daughter-in-law Diane whispered something that made them laugh harder. I could see my 10-year-old grandson Tommy's face change though. He looked uncomfortable, glancing between his parents and the door where I stood drenched. For a moment our eyes met through the glass, and I saw something like shame flicker across his young face before his mother pulled him away from the window. The rain grew heavier, plastering my thin white hair to my scalp. My coat, James's coat, hung heavy on my shoulders, no longer offering any protection. James would have never allowed this. My late husband had his flaws, Lord knows, but he understood family. He understood loyalty. You can't expect gratitude, he used to tell me, but you deserve basic decency. As another crack of lightning illuminated the yard, I remembered the day Matthew was born, how I'd held his tiny body against my chest for hours, counting his fingers and toes, promising him the world. How I'd worked 2 jobs after James hurt his back at the railroad, just to make sure Matthew could go to college. How I'd sold my mother's antique jewelry to help with the down payment on this very house, the house where I now stood locked out. I turned away, finally, the pain in my chest sharper than any physical discomfort from the storm. The garden path stretched before me, leading back to the small guest house where I'd been living since they convinced me to sell my home and move onto their property. So we can take care of you, Mom. Take care of me. The irony wasn't lost as I shuffled through puddles, my shoes squelching with every step. I hadn't gone 10 feet when I heard the door open behind me. "Mom!" Matthew called out, his voice suddenly concerned, as if he'd just noticed the downpour. "What are you doing out in this weather? Come inside." I stopped but didn't turn around. Not right away. I needed a moment to compose my face, to decide who I wanted to be in this moment. Because standing there in the rain, something had shifted inside me. Something fundamental had broken, and in its place, something else was forming. Something harder, colder, wiser. I turned slowly, water dripping from my chin, and looked at my son's suddenly solicitous face. Behind him, Diane was arranging her features into a mask of concern that never reached her eyes. "I forgot my medication," I said simply, the lie coming easily. "I thought I'd come get it." "Well, hurry up then," Matthew said, stepping aside. "You're letting the rain in." As I stepped across the threshold, I felt the warmth of the house hit my chilled skin. But inside, in my heart, something had gone cold. I remembered the keys again. 8 given away in trust and manipulation. And the ninth was about to become the most important one of all. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror as I passed. An old woman, soaked and small. But there was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. Resolve. That night, as I lay in my bed, listening to the storm continue its assault, I made a decision. The time for being a doormat was over. The 9th key would unlock more than just a safe. It would unlock my freedom, and it would teach them all that the rain falls on everyone eventually. James was a railroad accountant in Springfield for 34 years. Every day, he'd don his pressed navy blue suit, grab his worn leather briefcase, and head out before dawn to catch the 5:45 train. I can still smell his aftershave lingering in the hallway long after he'd left. Old Spice mixed with the scent of strong black coffee, the aroma of reliability itself. "Martha," he'd tell me on those quiet Sunday afternoons when we'd sit on the porch swing, my head resting on his shoulder as we watched the world go by. "Don't ever trust anyone completely with your money, not even me." I'd laugh then, thinking it was just his accountant's paranoia talking. But James had seen too many railway workers lose everything, their pensions, their savings, their dignity, to schemes and broken promises. "The system," he'd say, tapping his temple with his index finger, the same one that had a slight bend from being broken in his youth, "only works when you understand it yourself." When he retired in 2009, he was terrified, not of leisure time or boredom like some men, but of dying without leaving me protected. I remember the night he came home with that heavy metal safe, struggling to carry it through the door, his face flushed with the effort, veins prominent on his forearms. "What on earth, James?" I'd asked, rushing to help him. "Insurance," he'd replied, his breath coming in short gasps. For us both. That evening, after dinner, he showed me the 9 keys he'd had made, each one identical small brass things that caught the lamplight like tiny stars. 9 keys, Martha, each one for something precious we need to protect. He took my hands in his palms rough from years of work despite his desk job. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "The first key is for your grandmother's pearls and our marriage certificate. The second for the deed to the house. The third for the railroad pension documents." And so it went, each key assigned to protect a piece of our life together. "But why 9? I'd asked. "That seems excessive." His smile then was sad, knowing, "Because people will try to take things from you, Martha, especially when I'm gone, and you'll need options." I didn't understand then. How could I? Our son Matthew was successful, married to Diane, who came from a good family in Oak Ridge. They had little Tommy, our only grandchild, the light of our lives. The world seemed safe, our family solid. But James knew better. He always did. After his funeral, a rainy Tuesday in April, the church packed with railroad men who stood solemn in their uniforms, Matthew appeared at my door with a bouquet of white lilies. His eyes were red-rimmed, his suit impeccably pressed, the perfect picture of a grieving son. "Mom," he'd said, his voice breaking just enough to seem genuine, "we need to talk about your arrangements." I invited him in, made coffee the way he liked it. 1 sugar, splash of cream. We sat at the kitchen table where James and I had shared thousands of meals. "Dad had everything organized, right?" Matthew asked, stirring his coffee with precise movements. "He was always so methodical." The way he said that last word, like it was something distasteful, made something cold settle in my stomach. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Your father was very careful with our affairs." Matthew nodded, took a sip of his coffee. "I've been talking to some financial advisors. They say at your age, it's important to simplify, consolidate accounts, make transfers easier." And that's when I gave him the first key. Not because I trusted his sudden interest in my well-being, but because I wanted to see what he would do with it. 2 weeks later, Diane showed up with homemade banana bread, something she'd never done before, and questions about my investment portfolio. The words sounded rehearsed, her smile never reaching her eyes as she glanced around my living room, mentally appraising everything. I gave her the second key, then the third to Matthew when he mentioned helping with the taxes, the fourth when they suggested selling my house to move into their guest cottage for convenience. But something in me resisted giving them all 9. Perhaps it was James's voice in my head, whispering caution. Or perhaps it was the way Tommy, now 7, looked at me with confusion when his parents rushed him past my cottage on their way out, pretending not to see me waving from my garden. So I began hiding the remaining keys. The 5th went into an old perfume bottle that had belonged to my mother, Chanel No. 5, the glass still faintly fragrant decades later. The 6th I tucked into a hymnal at church, between pages 212 and 213. Amazing Grace, protecting my future. I watched and waited, keeping a careful eye on my accounts, noting the subtle changes. The way my pension deposits would be transferred out within hours of arriving. The way my credit card suddenly had new authorized users. James was right. He'd always been right. "Don't trust anyone completely," he'd said. "Not even family, especially family." That afternoon in April was unusually warm for Missouri. I remember because my arthritis wasn't bothering me as much as it typically did. The sky was a perfect shade of blue, the kind James used to say reminded him of my eyes when we first met at the Springfield County Fair in 1968. He'd been so poetic back then, before life and responsibility weathered him into the practical man I came to love even more deeply. Matthew had called that morning, his voice chipper and solicitous. "Mom, we need to get some paperwork sorted at the bank. Nothing complicated, just some updates to make things easier for you." I should have been suspicious right then. Matthew never voluntarily handled paperwork, not for his college applications, not for his first mortgage, and certainly not for his aging mother. But grief makes you vulnerable in ways you can't anticipate. It creates blind spots where there should be clarity. The Springfield First National Bank was a grand old building with marble columns and brass fixtures that gleamed under the soft lighting. I'd always felt a certain pride walking in there with James, his arm linked protectively through mine. Now I was being guided by my son, his hand on my elbow steering me rather than supporting me. We were ushered into a private room with leather chairs and wood paneling. The banker, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Mr. Henderson, greeted us with practiced warmth. "Mrs. Reynolds, so sorry about your loss. James was a fine man." Little Tommy, my grandson, had been brought along. He was 8 then, all gangly limbs and curious eyes. Matthew had given him a tablet with headphones, a distraction that worked perfectly. While the adults talked, Tommy was lost in some colorful game, occasionally tugging at my sleeve to show me his progress. "Look, Grandma, I got to level 7. Each time I would smile and pat his head, my attention divided between his innocent excitement and the stack of papers Mr. Henderson was organizing on the polished table. "It's really quite simple," Matthew explained, his voice taking on that tone people use when they think you might not understand. "We're just updating your accounts to make them more accessible. Dad had everything so compartmentalized." Mr. Henderson nodded in agreement. "It's very common for spouses of the deceased to streamline their financial arrangements. Less paperwork, fewer headaches." I squinted at the documents they placed before me. The print was small, too small. My reading glasses were in my purse, but Matthew was already pointing to lines with an expensive pen he produced from his breast pocket. "Just sign here, Mom, and initial here." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the page. Maybe I should take these home and read them properly. Diane, who had been silent until then, leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Martha, you know how these things are. Just boring legal language. Matthew has gone through it all with the banker. We're just trying to save you the trouble. Tommy tugged at my sleeve again. Grandma, look! I found a secret level. I turned to look at his screen, bright colors and flashing lights momentarily distracting me. When I looked back, Matthew had moved the pen into my hand. It's getting late, Mom. We still need to pick up dinner before taking you home. My fingers trembled slightly as I signed. One document, then another, then a third. As I signed, I felt James's presence beside me, his voice a warning whisper. Martha, what are you doing? Read before you sign. Always read. But I didn't. I was tired. My eyes hurt. And they were my family, my son, my daughter-in-law, my precious grandson. What harm could come from trusting them? That evening, back in my little cottage, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and a sick feeling in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the way Matthew had hurried me through the signatures, in the way Diane had checked her watch repeatedly, in the way they'd both seemed relieved when it was over. I reached for the phone to call my old friend Beatrice, who had worked in banking before her retirement. But before I could dial, I remembered what James had told me about the fifth key. I went to my bedroom, to the vanity where my mother's old perfume bottle sat among my modest collection of jewelry. The crystal Chanel No. 5 bottle caught the lamplight, sending tiny rainbows across the wall. I removed the stopper and tipped the bottle, carefully extracting the small brass key I'd hidden there. It felt warm in my palm, like a living thing. Later that week, I overheard a conversation that confirmed my suspicions. I had gone to Matthew and Diane's main house to return a casserole dish. The front door was unlocked, as it often was during the day. I stepped into the foyer, calling out, but no one answered. As I moved toward the kitchen, I heard hushed voices from Matthew's home office. She's falling right into our hands, Diane was saying, her voice low but triumphant. Soon we'll have full access. Keep your voice down, Matthew replied. We're not there yet. There's still the matter of the investment portfolio and the property deed. How much longer? This guest house renovation is bleeding us dry, and Tommy's private school tuition is due next month. I froze in the hallway. The casserole dish clutched against my chest. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain they would hear it. Not long, my son answered. She's confused most days anyway. Doesn't even remember what she had for breakfast. Getting her to sign the rest will be easy. I retreated silently, setting the dish on the entry table and slipping out the door. Back in my cottage, with shaking hands, I took out my old recipe notebook, the one with the yellowed pages and food stains from decades of use. Opening to a blank page at the back, I wrote with my best penmanship, "No funds shall be released without my physical presence and sound mind. Martha Reynolds." I dated it, folded the page, and tucked it into my sewing box, along with the sixth key. They thought I was confused, forgetful. But some things you never forget, like the look in your own son's eyes when he's lying to your face. I started noticing the changes in early June, about 2 months after I signed those papers at the bank. The Springfield summer was just beginning to bloom, hydrangeas bursting into blues and purples in the garden beds I'd planted years ago. But inside my son's home, the atmosphere had changed like a sudden frost. It began with the dinner invitations, or rather, the lack of them. "We're just so busy this week, Mom," Matthew would say when I called, his voice distracted, impatient. "Tommy has soccer practice, and Diane's got that charity thing." I'd been joining them for Sunday dinners for years, ever since James passed. It was our tradition. Now suddenly they were too busy, too occupied, too everything that meant not with you. When I did manage to secure an invitation, the meals were strained affairs. Diane would serve smaller portions on my plate, as if rationing food for an unwelcome guest. Conversations would halt when I entered rooms. Smiles would become fixed, artificial things that never reached their eyes. "Would you like some more water, Martha?" Diane would ask. emphasizing my first name in that way that always felt like a tiny rebellion against calling me Mom. One evening, I noticed Tommy watching me with a strange expression as I told a story about his grandfather. At 10 years old, he was at that precarious age, old enough to understand undercurrents, young enough to be confused by them. "Grandma," he interrupted, his small brow furrowed, "Dad says we have to be careful with money now because of you. Did you do something bad?" The table went silent. Matthew's fork clattered against his plate. Diane's smile tightened like a drawstring purse. "Tommy," she hissed, "that's enough. Go to your room." "But I just—" "Now, Tommy." After he trudged upstairs, Matthew cleared his throat. "Kids, you know, they misunderstand things." But I knew better. I could read between the lines. Something had changed in their financial situation, and somehow I was being blamed. That night, back in my cottage, I did something I hadn't done since I was a teenager, keeping track of neighborhood gossip. I started a diary, not in a fancy leather-bound journal, but in an old recipe book where the middle pages were blank. The faded cover, stained with decades of flour and butter, would never draw attention. It was the perfect hiding place. On the first blank page, in my shaky handwriting, I wrote, "Today, Tommy said they have to be careful with money because of me. Matthew has been checking the mailbox before I can get to it. Diane forgot to invite me to her garden club meeting, though she knows I helped start it years ago. Each day, I added new observations, small cruelties, whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The way Diane would ostensibly help me clean my cottage, but really seemed to be searching for something. Today she looked inside my jewelry box while pretending to dust. All of Mom's good pieces are hidden in the fake bottom of the sugar canister. Matthew asked about investment paperwork 3 times this week. Said he needs to consolidate things. Tommy wasn't allowed to come visit me alone anymore. Diane said he has too much homework. One afternoon, I was sitting in my small garden, deadheading the roses James and I had planted together when we first built the cottage. The sun was warm on my shoulders, the familiar task bringing comfort in its repetition. I heard the patio door of the main house open and close, followed by the murmur of voices. "It's not in her cottage," Diane was saying, her voice carrying across the yard, though she was clearly trying to keep it low. "I've looked everywhere. She must have another account somewhere," Matthew replied. "The transfers have stopped. The money's disappearing somewhere." Their voices faded as they moved further into their yard, but I'd heard enough. They'd discovered that I'd requested the bank to stop the automatic transfers from my accounts to theirs, a decision I'd made after finding a bank statement showing thousands of dollars moving from my savings to an account I didn't recognize. That evening, I added to my diary, "They've noticed the transfers stopped. They're searching for something. The 7th key needs a new hiding place." The next day, when I went to place Tommy's birthday gift, a hand-knitted sweater and a $20 bill, on the kitchen counter of the main house, I overheard Matthew on the phone in his office. "I don't care what she told you," he was saying, his voice tight with anger. "She's confused, getting forgetful. Yes, I have power of attorney. What do you mean it's been revoked? That's impossible." I slipped out without being noticed, my heart racing. Claire, the bank manager I'd visited privately, had followed through on my request. The protection I'd put in place was working. The consequences were swift and bitter. That evening, Tommy didn't come to my door for his usual after-school cookie and milk. When I called the house, Diane answered with ice in her voice. "Tommy's busy with homework. And actually, Martha, Matthew and I think it's best if you don't spoil him with sweets anymore. The dentist mentioned cavities at his last checkup. I hadn't missed the transition from Mom to Martha being complete. I was no longer family. I was an obstacle. At Sunday dinner that week, an obligation they still couldn't quite figure out how to cancel without seeming cruel to outsiders, I noticed something else. My photograph, the one that had sat on the living room mantel for years, was gone. It was a picture of James and me on our 40th anniversary, both of us laughing as we cut the cake at the party Matthew had thrown for us. In its place was a new arrangement of Diane's porcelain birds. Tommy caught me looking and whispered when the others were in the kitchen, "Dad put your picture in the drawer, Grandma." He said it was cluttering the mantel. I squeezed his small hand. It's okay, sweetheart. But it wasn't okay. None of it was okay. That night, I buried the 7th key in a small metal box beneath the tulip bulbs I was planting for spring. As I patted the soil down, I thought about James and what he would say if he could see how our son was treating me. Remember what I told you, Martha? I could almost hear him say. The 9th key is the most important of all. The morning after the storm, my bones ached with a deep chill that no amount of hot tea could chase away. I shuffled around my little cottage, wrapping myself in the hand-knitted Afghan James's mother had made for our wedding gift 48 years ago. The colors had faded, the once vibrant blues and purples now soft like watercolors, but it still brought comfort, still smelled faintly of lavender and home. Outside my window, puddles reflected a clear blue Missouri sky, as if the previous night's tempest had never happened. But the muddy footprints on my welcome mat told a different story. My own leading in. No one else's leading out to check if I'd made it home safely. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror as I brushed my thinning silver hair. The woman looking back at me seemed different somehow, her eyes harder, more resolved. Last night had changed something fundamental inside me. Being left in the rain, hearing my own son suggest they leave me there to learn, had broken whatever remained of my motherly delusions. Enough, I whispered to my reflection, pressing the cool bristles of the brush against my palm. It's time. I dressed carefully that morning, not in my usual house dress, but in the navy blue pantsuit I'd worn to James's funeral. It was slightly too big now. Grief and age had whittled away at my already slight frame, but it was clean, pressed, and respectable. The kind of outfit that said, I am not to be trifled with. First National Bank of Springfield was a 20-minute bus ride from my neighborhood. I'd memorized the schedule years ago, but rarely used public transportation since Matthew had insisted I stop driving. For safety, he'd said. But now I wondered if it had been to control my movements, to keep me dependent. The bus lurched and swayed through morning traffic, and I clutched my purse tightly on my lap. Inside was my ID, my social security card, and the small notebook where I documented every suspicious conversation, every unexplained financial transaction, every slight and cruelty over the past months. Evidence. When I walked into the bank and as the security guard, a kind-faced man about my son's age, tipped his hat. Morning, ma'am. Can I help you find something? I need to speak with Claire Henderson, please, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It's about my accounts. He directed me to the customer service desk, where a young woman with copper hair and freckles greeted me with a professional smile. Mrs. Reynolds, what a surprise! Matthew was just here yesterday asking about your accounts. My heart skipped. Was he? And what did you tell him? Her smile faltered slightly. Well, I explained that without you present, there wasn't much information I could provide. He seemed disappointed. I'm sure he was, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Claire, I need your help. Something isn't right with my finances, and I'm afraid my family may be taking advantage. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine concern. Let's go to my office, Mrs. Reynolds. Claire's office was small but neat, with family photos arranged carefully on her desk. She closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. Now, what seems to be the problem? For the next half hour, I laid it all out. The papers I'd signed without reading properly, the automatic transfers I'd discovered, the overheard conversations about access and confusion. I showed her my notebook with its careful documentation. By the time I finished, Claire's freckles stood out starkly against her suddenly pale face. Mrs. Reynolds, she said slowly, her fingers tapping on her keyboard. According to our records, your son attempted to initiate several significant transfers yesterday. Transfers that would have effectively emptied your main savings account. The room seemed to tilt slightly. And did those transfers go through? Claire shook her head. No. There's a safeguard on your account. It requires dual authentication for any amount over $10,000. We couldn't process it without your in-person signature or phone verification. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by a wave of grief so profound it stole my breath. My own son had tried to empty my accounts. The boy I'd nursed through chicken pox and heartbreaks, taught to ride a bike and drive a car, had betrayed me in the most fundamental way. "Mrs. Reynolds, are you all right?" Claire's voice seemed to come from far away. I blinked back tears. "What can I do, Claire? How do I protect myself?" Her expression hardened with resolve. "We're going to freeze everything right now. No access for anyone but you in person with proper ID. Then we're going to review every transaction from the past year to see what's already been taken. And then," she paused, reaching across the desk to squeeze my trembling hand, "we're going to talk about pressing charges if necessary." Charges? The word felt foreign in my mouth. Against my own son? Financial elder abuse is a crime, Mrs. Reynolds. What they've done, what they've tried to do is illegal. I sat there, the weight of my options pressing down on me like a physical thing. Through the window behind Claire, I could see people going about their day. Young mothers with strollers, businessmen checking watches, teenagers laughing together. Normal life continuing while mine crumbled around me. "Freeze it all," I said finally. "Every account, every card, and let's look at those transactions." By the time we finished, it was early afternoon. Claire had documented unauthorized transfers totaling over $47,000 in the past 6 months alone. Money siphoned from my accounts in small enough increments to avoid triggering alerts, but large enough to have seriously depleted my savings. "We can reverse some of these," Claire said, circling several lines on the printout she'd generated. "But others are too old for automatic reversal. For those, we'd need to file formal fraud reports." "Do it," I said, my voice hollow. "Do whatever is necessary." As I prepared to leave, Claire handed me her business card with her personal cell number written on the back. "Call me any time, Mrs. Reynolds, day or night, and," she hesitated, "be careful when you go home. People can react unpredictably when their financial schemes are disrupted." I nodded, tucking the card into my purse beside my notebook. "Thank you, Claire, for believing me." "Of course I believe you," she said simply. "The numbers don't lie, even when people do." The bus ride home felt interminable. Each bump in the road jolted through my weary body, each stop stretching the journey back to a place that no longer felt like home. I closed my eyes, imagining James beside me, his large hand covering mine. "You did right, Martha," I could almost hear him say. "The 9th key was always your courage." When I finally reached my cottage, the main house was empty. No cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows. A small mercy. I needed time to prepare for what would come next. Inside, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in my rocking chair by the window, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across my small garden. The tulip bulbs I'd planted over the 7th key would bloom in spring, but I wouldn't be here to see them. That much I knew now. This cottage, this garden, this life beside my son and his family, it was over. The storm had washed away the last of my illusions, and Claire had helped me secure what remained of my financial independence. Now I just had to wait for the inevitable confrontation. It would come soon enough, perhaps as early as tomorrow, when their cards stopped working, when their attempts to access my accounts triggered security alerts. They would come to my door then, not to leave me in the rain, but to demand answers. And I would be ready. The pounding on my door started at exactly 7:04 a.m. I know because I'd been awake since 5, sitting in my rocking chair by the window, watching the sunrise paint the Missouri sky in shades of pink and gold. I'd made a small pot of coffee, James's favorite dark roast that I kept for special occasions, and sipped it slowly from the mug he'd given me on our 40th anniversary. The ceramic was worn smooth from years of use. The painted flowers faded to ghostly outlines. I didn't rush to answer. Let them wait, I thought. Let them feel a fraction of the uncertainty I'd felt standing in the rain. "Mom, open up! We need to talk to you!" Matthew's voice was different than I'd heard it in years. Strained, urgent, with an edge of panic that almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. I took another sip of coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. Then I set the mug down carefully on the side table, smoothed the front of my cardigan, and made my way slowly to the door. My arthritis was acting up. Each step sent a twinge of pain through my hip. Weather's changing, I thought absently. Storm coming. How right I was. When I finally opened the door, the sight that greeted me was almost worth everything I'd been through. Matthew stood there, his usually immaculate appearance in disarray. Hair uncombed, shirt wrinkled and buttoned incorrectly, eyes bloodshot with dark circles beneath them. Behind him, Diane paced the small porch, her manicured nails clicking against her phone screen as she frantically tapped away. "Mom," Matthew said, relief washing over his face. "Thank God. We've been trying to reach you." I feigned confusion. "Have you? I was just having my morning coffee. Can we come in, please? It's important." I hesitated, then stepped aside. They rushed in like the cottage might disappear if they didn't secure a place inside. I noticed they both looked around quickly, taking inventory of my belongings with new interest. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, the perfect picture of maternal concern. "Mom, something's happened with the accounts," Matthew said, ignoring my offer. "All our cards are declined. The bank says everything's frozen." I lowered myself carefully into my rocking chair. "Is that so?" Diane stopped her pacing and turned to me, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawn together in distress. "Martha, this is serious. Tommy's school tuition payment bounced. We can't access any of the accounts. Even the joint checking account is locked." "How terrible," I said, my voice steady. "Financial troubles can be so stressful." Matthew stared at me, realization dawning slowly across his face. "You did this," he said. Not a question, but an accusation. "You went to the bank." "I did," I confirmed, meeting his gaze. "Yesterday." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Outside, a cardinal landed on my bird feeder, its bright red plumage a splash of color against the morning sky. I watched it for a moment, thinking how James had built that feeder in his workshop, sanding each piece by hand until it was smooth as silk. "Why?" Matthew finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" I repeated, looking back at him. "Because you left me standing in the rain, Matthew. Because you laughed while I knocked. Because you've been stealing from me for months, years maybe. Because you thought I was too old, too confused, too trusting to notice." Diane made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a gasp. "That's ridiculous. We've been helping you manage your finances because you can't do it yourself anymore. Is that what you call it? Helping?" I pulled my notebook from the pocket of my cardigan and opened it. April 17th, transfer of $4,000 to an account I don't recognize. May 3rd, another $3,500. June 12th, $5,000. Shall I go on? Matthew's face had drained of color. "Those were investments. For your future." "My future?" I laughed. And the sound surprised even me, hard and cold, like ice cracking. "You mean the extension on your house? The new SUV in your driveway? Tommy's private school? Those aren't my future, Matthew. Those are luxuries you decided you deserved, paid for with my retirement." "You don't understand," Diane interjected, her voice shrill. "We've sacrificed everything to take care of you. We built this cottage. We check on you. We invite you for dinner. And you think that entitles you to empty my accounts?" I asked quietly. "To take advantage of my trust? To leave me standing in the rain when I'm no longer convenient?" Matthew sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "What do you want, Mom? Just tell us what you want." What did I want? Such a simple question with such a complicated answer. I wanted my husband back. I wanted the son I'd raised, not this stranger who saw me as a bank account rather than a mother. I wanted dignity in my final years, not to be treated like a burden or a resource to be exploited. "I want what's mine," I said finally, "and I want respect." "So unfreeze the accounts," Diane said, stepping forward. "We can talk about this like adults. Come up with a plan that works for everyone." I shook my head. "Claire at the bank has helped me set up new accounts, ones that only I can access. The freeze is temporary, just until we sort out what's been taken and what remains." "Taken?" Matthew's head snapped up. "You think we stole from you?" "I know you did," I corrected him gently. "And Claire knows it too. She's prepared to file fraud reports if necessary." The color that had drained from Matthew's face returned in a rush, angry red splotches on his cheeks. "You do that?" To your own son. Report me to the police. I hope it doesn't come to that, I said honestly. But it depends on what happens next. Diane dropped onto the couch beside Matthew, her composure finally cracking. We can't make the mortgage payment, she whispered. Or the car payments, everything will fall apart. I felt a pang of sadness, not for them, but for what we'd become. A family so broken that money was the only language we still spoke to each other. There's one more thing, I said, reaching into my cardigan's other pocket. I pulled out a folded document and placed it on the coffee table between us. I've given notice on the cottage. I'm moving out at the end of the month. The shock on their faces would have been comical under different circumstances. Moving? Where? Matthew asked, genuine confusion in his voice. You can't live alone, Mom. You need us. I need people who care about me, not what I can give them, I corrected him. I found a nice senior living community in Springfield, close to the library and the park. I've already put down a deposit. With what money? Diane demanded, always focused on the practical. With my money, I emphasized. The money James and I saved over 50 years of hard work and careful planning. The money you thought I didn't know how to manage. Matthew picked up the notice, scanning it as if the words might change if he stared hard enough. Mom, please, let's not be hasty. We can work this out. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw flashes of the boy he'd been. The toddler who'd clung to my leg on his first day of preschool. The teenager who'd wept in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart. The young man who'd hugged me so tightly at his college graduation that I could barely breathe. Where had that boy gone? I hope we can, I said softly. But not today. Today I need you both to leave. Leave, Diane repeated incredulously. Without resolving anything? Yes, I said, standing up with effort. I need time to think. And I suspect you both have some financial matters to attend to. They left reluctantly, casting backward glances at me as if I might vanish when they turned away, as if I were the one who had disappeared, not them. When the door closed behind them, I returned to my rocking chair and picked up my cooling coffee. The cardinal was gone from the feeder, but a pair of finches had taken its place, working together to crack open sunflower seeds. You were right, James, I whispered to the empty room. The ninth key was the most important of all. The days after their desperate morning visit passed in a strange calm. The cottage felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of pretense had been lifted. I spent my time sorting through my belongings, deciding what to take to my new apartment in the senior living community and what to leave behind. Each item held memories. The blue ceramic vase James had bought me on our trip to Santa Fe for our 35th anniversary. The quilt my mother had made when Matthew was born. The collection of pressed wildflowers from hikes James and I had taken along the Missouri River. It was like archaeology of a life, digging through layers of existence, determining what still held value and what could be released. Tommy came to visit 3 days after his parents' desperate visit. He knocked on my door politely, standing on the porch with his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans, looking so much like Matthew at that age that it made my heart ache. Hi, Grandma, he said when I opened the door. Can I come in? I ushered him inside, noting the way his eyes took in the half-packed boxes scattered around the small living room. Would you like some cookies? I made snickerdoodles yesterday. He nodded, a tentative smile crossing his face. They're my favorite. I know, I said, leading him to the kitchen where I'd laid out a plate of cookies and a glass of milk, anticipating his visit. Mothers and grandmothers develop a sixth sense about these things. Tommy sat at the small kitchen table, taking a cookie but not eating it immediately. Instead, he turned it over in his hands, examining the cinnamon sugar coating as if it might contain answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. Dad and Mom are fighting a lot, he finally said, his voice small. About money and stuff. Dad sleeps on the couch now. I nodded, sitting across from him with my own cookie. I'm sorry to hear that, Tommy. Dad says you're moving away to an old people's home. He looked up at me, his blue eyes, James's eyes, wide with concern. Is that true? It's called Golden Horizons, I corrected gently. And yes, I'm moving there next week. It's a very nice place with people my own age. I'll have my own apartment, and there's a library and a garden and even a movie theater. But why? The plaintiveness in his voice nearly broke my heart. Don't you want to live near us anymore? How to explain adult complexities to a child? How to tell him that his parents had betrayed me, had stolen from me, had laughed while I stood in the rain? How to preserve his innocence while still honoring the truth? Sometimes, I said carefully, people need a fresh start, a new beginning. That's what I'm doing. Tommy took a bite of his cookie considering this. Because Mom and Dad took your money, I nearly choked on my own cookie. What makes you say that, Tommy? He shrugged with the matter-of-factness only children can muster. I heard them talking. Dad said they borrowed from your accounts, but you found out, and now they're in trouble. Mom said they deserved that money for taking care of you. He looked down at the table. But they don't take care of you very much, Grandma. You take care of yourself, and sometimes you take care of me too, out of the mouths of babes. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his smaller one. You're very observant, Tommy. Is that why you're leaving? Because they were mean to you? I'm leaving because I need to be somewhere where I'm respected, I said gently, where I can make my own choices and live my own life. He nodded slowly, processing this. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made this for you, so you won't forget us. Forget me. I unfolded the paper to find a crayon drawing of Tommy and me, standing hand in hand beside what appeared to be a rainbow-colored building labeled Old Pepple Home. Above us, in careful block letters, he'd written, I love you, Grandma. Tears pricked my eyes. I could never forget you, Tommy, never. And you can visit me anytime you want. I'll give you my new address and phone number. Really? His face brightened. Mom said you probably wouldn't want to see us anymore. You, I emphasized, are always welcome, always. I hesitated, then added, and if you ever need anything at all, you can come to me, I promise. He smiled then, a genuine smile that reminded me so much of Matthew as a boy that it physically hurt. He took another cookie and bit into it with the enthusiasm only a 10-year-old can muster. We spent the next hour together, Tommy helping me pack some of my books and telling me about school, his friends, the science project he was working on. Normal, everyday conversation that felt like cool water in a desert. As he was preparing to leave, he paused at the door. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. What's the 9th key for? Dad keeps talking about it. He says if they had the 9th key, everything would be okay. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. So Matthew was still searching, still believing there was one more physical key that would unlock some hidden fortune. I knelt down to Tommy's level, looking directly into his eyes. The 9th key isn't something you can hold in your hand, Tommy. It's not a real key. His brow furrowed in confusion. Then what is it? It's knowing when to say no. It's standing up for yourself when people try to take advantage of you. It's remembering your own worth, even when others forget it. I touched his cheek gently. Your grandfather taught me that, and someday, I hope you'll learn it too. Tommy looked thoughtful, like when Billy Jensen tried to make me give him my lunch money, and I told the teacher instead of just giving it to him. I smiled. Exactly like that. The 9th key is your strength, your self-respect, and no one can take that from you unless you let them. After Tommy left, I sat in my rocking chair by the window, watching as he walked back to the main house. I wondered if he would tell Matthew what I'd said about the 9th key. Probably. Children rarely keep such conversations to themselves, and perhaps it was better that way. Better for Matthew to understand that what he'd been searching for had never been hidden in a safe or a bank box or buried in the garden. The next day, they came back. Matthew and Diane, looking more disheveled than before. Matthew's eyes were bloodshot, his face unshaven. Diane's perfect manicure was chipped, her designer clothes wrinkled. Tommy said you told him about the 9th key, Matthew said, without preamble when I opened the door. He said it's not real. I sighed, stepping back to let them in. That's right. But Dad always said there were 9 keys, Matthew insisted, a desperate edge to his voice. 9 keys to 9 parts of your estate. We found 8. There has to be a 9th. Your father was speaking metaphorically about the ninth key, I explained, settling into my rocking chair while they remained standing awkwardly among my half-packed boxes. It was never a physical key. It was a lesson. A lesson? Diane's voice was sharp with disbelief. What kind of lesson? The kind I had to learn the hard way, I said quietly. That sometimes the people closest to you are the ones you need to protect yourself from the most. Matthew flinched as if I'd slapped him. So there's no other account, no other safety deposit box, no hidden asset. I shook my head. No, Matthew. What you see is what there is, and most of that is now secured where you can't access it. They left shortly after, shoulders slumped in defeat. I watched them cross the garden path back to their house, noticing how they didn't touch, didn't speak, didn't look at each other. The distance between them seemed vast and growing. That evening, as I packed the last of my photo albums, I came across a picture of Matthew's 5th birthday. James had his arm around our son's shoulders, both of them beaming at the camera, matching dimples in their cheeks. I remembered that day so clearly. The chocolate cake I'd baked from scratch, the toy truck James had built in his workshop, the absolute joy on Matthew's face when he unwrapped it. Where had that boy gone? When had he transformed from the child who wanted to be just like his father into a man who would steal from his mother? Had I failed him somehow? Had James and I, in our determination to give him everything, somehow taught him that he deserved whatever he wanted, regardless of who it hurt? These were questions without answers, at least not simple ones. As I carefully wrapped the photo album in tissue paper and placed it in a box, I realized that some mysteries remain unsolved, some wounds unhealed, some bridges once burned stay ash. The ninth key, my ability to say no, to stand my ground, to value myself, had saved me from financial ruin, but it couldn't restore what had been lost. Trust, respect, the bond between mother and son that I had once believed unbreakable. Yet as I sealed the box with packing tape, I felt not despair, but a curious sense of freedom. The ninth key had unlocked not just my financial independence, but something more valuable. The courage to begin again, even at 73, to rewrite the final chapters of my story on my own terms. Tomorrow the movers would come. Tomorrow I would leave this cottage and the family that had forgotten how to love me. Tomorrow would bring a new beginning, and tonight, for the first time in months, I would sleep peacefully, knowing that the ninth key, the one that had never existed in physical form, was safely tucked away where no one could ever take it from me again. In my heart, in my resolve, in my newfound strength. Golden Horizons, senior living community was nothing like I had imagined. When I'd signed the papers and put down my deposit, I'd steeled myself for sterile hallways, institutional lighting, and the faint smell of disinfectant that seems to permeate places where the elderly gather. Instead, I found a place that felt more like a small village than a facility. A collection of charming apartments arranged around courtyards filled with blooming gardens, walking paths that wound through stands of mature oak trees, and common spaces designed to foster community rather than merely house residence. My apartment was on the second floor of Willow Building, with a small balcony that overlooked a pond where ducks paddled contentedly in the early morning mist. I'd brought only what mattered most: James's recliner, our wedding quilt, the bookshelf he'd built me for our 15th anniversary, filled with dog-eared paperbacks and photo albums. The walls I painted myself, a soft, buttery yellow that caught the light in a way that made even cloudy days feel warm. 3 months had passed since I'd left the cottage behind. 3 months of quiet mornings with coffee on my balcony, of afternoon card games in the community room, of evenings spent reading or watching old movies, with new friends who carried their own histories of love and loss. I hadn't heard from Matthew or Diane since the day I moved. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a single acknowledgement that I'd relocated just 20 minutes away. It stung, of course, but less with each passing day. The wound was scabbing over, healing slowly as new experiences and connections filled the space left by their absence. Tommy, though. Tommy visited every Saturday afternoon, taking the public bus from his neighborhood to mine, appearing at my door with his backpack full of school books and whatever small treasure he'd found that week to show me. A perfect pine cone, an unusual rock, a drawing he'd made in art class. I'd make him lunch, grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles just the way he liked them, and we'd talk about his week, his friends, the things that mattered in the life of a 10-year-old boy. He never mentioned his parents, and I never asked. Some boundaries are best left undisturbed, especially when they protect the fragile relationship between a grandmother and grandson, navigating complicated family dynamics. It was on a crisp October morning, the trees outside my window ablaze with autumn colors, that I received the letter from Claire at the bank. The formal letterhead seemed at odds with the warmth of her handwritten note at the bottom. Dear Mrs. Reynolds, I'm pleased to inform you that the audit of your accounts is complete. As we suspected, unauthorized transactions totaling $72,131.56 were identified over the past 18 months. These funds have been recovered and deposited back into your secure account. Please find enclosed a detailed report of all transactions and recoveries. If you wish to pursue legal action, please contact me directly at the number below. If not, no further action is required on your part. Warmly, Claire Henderson. And below, in her neat handwriting, Martha, I hope you're settling in well at Golden Horizons. Let me know if you'd like to meet for coffee sometime. I've been thinking about your idea for the literacy program. It has real potential. Claire. I read the letter twice, then set it aside and went to make myself a cup of tea. The kettle whistled cheerfully as I stared out the window at a cardinal perched on the bird bath outside. Such a simple thing, that flash of red against the backdrop of golden leaves. Such a small moment of beauty in an ordinary day. James would have pointed it out, would have called me to the window to see it. Look, Martha, he would have said. Nature's showing off just for us today. The thought brought a smile rather than tears. Progress. As I carried my tea back to the small desk in the corner of my living room, I pulled out a fresh sheet of stationery, the good kind, cream-colored with a subtle texture, and began to write a response to Claire. No, I would not be pursuing legal action against my son. The money had been recovered. That was enough. Some relationships once broken cannot be repaired with lawsuits and legal proceedings. Some wounds need different medicine. Instead, I outlined my idea for the rural literacy program in more detail. During my years as a school teacher before Tommy was born, I'd seen how many adults in our community struggled with basic reading and writing skills. Farmers, factory workers, homemakers, intelligent, hard-working people who had fallen through the cracks of the education system and carried the shame of illiteracy like a hidden burden. I'd volunteered at the community center back then, teaching evening classes, watching the pride bloom on faces as letters formed into words, words into sentences, sentences into stories they could read to their children. That program had folded years ago when funding dried up. But now, with my recovered money and the remainder of my savings secure, I had the means to restart it, to create something lasting and meaningful that would outlive me. I was halfway through the letter when there was a knock at my door. Not Tommy's knock. He had a distinctive pattern, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones. This was hesitant, almost timid. When I opened the door, I found Matthew standing there, looking as uncomfortable as I'd ever seen him. Gone was the polished businessman who had manipulated me so effortlessly. In his place stood a man who appeared to have aged years in just a few months, hair graying at the temples, new lines etched around his mouth, shoulders slightly stooped. "Mom," he said, his voice rough. "Can I come in?" I hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. He entered cautiously, looking around my new apartment with surprise evident in his expression. "This is nice," he said, sounding genuinely startled. Not what I expected. "What did you expect?" I asked, gesturing for him to sit in the armchair while I took James's recliner. He shrugged, perching on the edge of the chair as if afraid to settle in. "I don't know. Something less homelike, I guess." We sat in awkward silence for a moment. Outside, a group of residents walked past on the path below my window, their laughter floating up like bubbles in the air. "Diane and I are getting divorced," Matthew finally said, staring at his hands. "She's moved out, taken most of the furniture." I nodded, unsurprised. The cracks had been visible for years, in the way they spoke to each other, in the distance that seemed to grow between them with each passing day. The financial stress of losing access to my accounts had likely been the final blow to an already fragile structure. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. No matter what they'd done, I wouldn't wish the pain of divorce on anyone. "Tommy's having a hard time with it," he continued. "He doesn't understand why everything's changed so suddenly." A pang of sadness for my grandson shot through me. "Children often bear the heaviest burden in these situations," I said quietly, "through no fault of their own." Matthew looked up then, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "I know you think I'm a terrible person, Mom, and maybe I am. What I did to you was unforgivable." I didn't contradict him. It was unforgivable, at least for now. Perhaps someday, with time and genuine remorse, forgiveness might be possible. But not yet. Not today. "Why are you here, Matthew?" I asked gently. He took a deep breath. "2 reasons. First, to tell you that I'm sorry, truly sorry. Not just because it all blew up in my face, but because I betrayed you in the worst way. You deserved better from your son." The words hung in the air between us. Neither accepted nor rejected, just acknowledged. "And the second reason? Tommy," he said simply. "He misses you terribly. I know he's been visiting on his own, and I'm grateful you've allowed that. But he wants more. He asked if you could come to his school play next month. He's got a small part, just a tree in the forest scene, but it means the world to him." My heart softened at the thought of Tommy on stage, probably in a costume I imagined was crafted from brown construction paper and green tissue. Of course I would go. I'd never miss it. "I'll be there," I assured him. "Just send me the details." Matthew nodded, relief evident in his expression. He stood awkwardly, clearly preparing to leave. "Thank you for seeing me, for agreeing to come to the play, for not hating me completely." I rose as well, walking him to the door. "I don't hate you, Matthew. I'm disappointed and hurt, but I don't hate you. You're still my son." At the door, he paused, reaching into his jacket pocket. "One more thing. I found this while cleaning out some old boxes in the attic. I thought you might want it back." He handed me a small brass key, the 7th key, the one I'd buried beneath the tulips in the garden at the cottage. My breath caught in my throat. "How did you—" "The gardener found it when he was replanting the bulbs," Matthew explained. I recognized it as one of Dad's keys right away. I took it, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. "Thank you," I said softly. After Matthew left, I sat by the window for a long time, turning the key over and over in my hands. It was just a small piece of metal, no longer connected to anything that needed unlocking. Yet it felt significant somehow, a tangible link to the past, to James, to the life we'd built together. I finally rose and placed it in my jewelry box, nestled among my mother's pearls and the locket that held a tiny photograph of James and me on our wedding day. Then I returned to my desk and finished writing my letter to Claire, outlining the details of the Missouri Rural Literacy Project that would soon become my legacy. The 9th key had unlocked more than just my financial freedom. It had unlocked a new chapter of my life, one written entirely in my own hand, on my own terms. And in that chapter, I would build something that couldn't be stolen or manipulated or taken away, something that would touch lives long after I was gone. That, I decided, was the greatest victory of all. Sometimes the strongest choices we make aren't about what we gain, but what we refuse to lose. Martha's journey reminds us that dignity isn't something that comes with wealth or youth. It's something we must claim for ourselves, even when those closest to us try to strip it away. What would you do if the family you built, with decades of love and sacrifice, suddenly saw you as nothing more than a resource to be exploited? Would you have had Martha's courage to stand in the rain, soaking wet, and still find the strength to say, "Enough"? The 9th key was never about money at all. It was about something far more valuable, the power to recognize your own worth when others fail to see it. In a world that often dismisses the elderly as burdens rather than bearers of wisdom, Martha's quiet revolution reminds us that it's never too late to rewrite your story. Sometimes the greatest inheritance we leave behind isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lessons we teach about standing firm in our truth, even when it breaks our hearts to do so. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need its message today. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Martha's place, or share a story about an elder in your life who taught you the value of dignity and self-respect. Remember that somewhere, there's a Martha waiting in the rain, and perhaps your kindness could be the shelter they are looking for.